Welcome, and today I want to continue our little journey in San Francisco. And I didn't even want to do the last video on San Francisco, but I just keep being pulled back to this scenario for some reason. It's just absolutely astounding that this city is built in 1850. What they tell us is that this fire killed 3,000 people, and it was rebuilt. But what is so baffling is that it looks like everyone in this city was wiped out. I mean, there's nothing left. There's nowhere to even be. I mean, where did everyone go? They seem to leave that out. There's nothing. There's nowhere for anyone to hang out. Now, I want to look at these photos from 1850. I did a search and wanted to see if there were any photos from 1850, because if you remember my last video, there were 1,000 people in 1849. 1,000 people. So I said, okay, let's look at pictures from 1850. And it took me a few different places, but here's one for example. Now this is from 1854. 1854. And what they tell us is that this is the Roman Catholic Orphan Asylum and the St. Patrick's Church. And pretty interesting and pretty aged. But again, we could give them the benefit of the doubt. That this picture that we're seeing, these are the first 1,000 people. But, I'm sure if we turn this camera to the right or left, we would see a lot more. Just in this little image that we're seeing, there's probably 1,000 people. And we know San Francisco is a lot bigger than this little slice. For a settling 1,000 people, really amazing architecture. And back here, it's almost looking castle-like on this hill. Really amazing. So 1883. So, less than 15 years later, we have the Knights of Templar parade on Market Street in 1883. So again, look at these beautiful buildings. And just the style of town, to imagine in 15 years that they threw these babies up, gold miners. And I'm not sure what's going on back here. I mean, really interesting. Look at this building with what look like holes in it. And again, I got a lot of comments in my last video about, were those photos before the World's Fair? And just to be sure, that again piqued my curiosity to come in and look. And sure enough, we do see these images pre-World Fair. Even right here, this is pre-World Fair. And, only less than 15 years after the inception of the city do we see this amazing, amazing architecture. I mean, look at this ornamentation around this entryway with this horse statue. And, I mean, this is really something else. And, when you search San Francisco in Wikipedia, you are not going to get these photos. They're not going to show you such things. And again, they're going to show you the 1915 World's Fair and tell you that the buildings were temporary, but this is on Market Street. This has nothing to do with the World's Fair. Okay, look at this. Look at this. E pluribus unum. This, what I'm going to say is more of a Tartarian emblem than any San Franciscan ornamentation. And I don't know if this still exists, but this is absolutely amazing. I've never seen anything like this around an arch. This is really special. And this is the 1886 Grand Army of the Republic, the Triumphal Arch. So, I mean, this is the most amazing city ever. And so here they're telling us 1890, celebrating California's 40th birthday. This looks a lot older. The weathering on this building, it almost looks like, pollution or soot. 1905, a little action on the streets. So this would be 50 years. This is still pre-World Fair. And just to show again the build-out in 50 years. 50 years. This one is from 1906. And, well, look at this little owl here. And, I wanted to comment on some of these shadows that I was noticing. I mean, this is an early morning shadow. And there's still, here's some people walking. And this would be in 1901. But look at this look at this overhang architecture with columns, overhanging columns. I mean, really special. 1860s, a view of Market Street. And again, 1860. So this is a great one. This depicts what they are telling us 10 years of development has taken place, again, in just a little sliver that we can see here. 10 years, the gold miners come in. And the truth is, this is not as impressive as a lot of the architecture that we were just looking at in the front. But if we look in the back here, I mean, we have cathedrals and spires. What is this? 2, 3, 4 blocks over, another cathedral. And, back here, I mean, look at this. Not what you would expect for 10 years of development. Again, 1860s. Here's these onion domes that we saw in another picture. And here, 1860. So this verifies this picture that I was showing earlier. This verifies that this onion dome was already here. Here it is. Now let's jump back over here and look at it from this angle. So this was a photo in 1877, they told us. This beautiful panoramic that we get of the whole city. 1877. So this was only, 15 years after the inception of San Francisco. So in 15 years, the mainstream narrative tells us that all of this was built. And now this photo is showing us that in 10 years, most of what we're seeing was already here. I guess this is only proving the point that much more. Now this is getting ridiculous, that we would have this in 10 years. And, 15 years later, it looks like this, although I really don't see very much difference between this and this. It's just a different angle. We're seeing a lot less in this photograph. And when we look at it in this photograph, it's just absolutely amazing. Like we just saw, the photos of 1860 where, the city is built out and beautiful, but then we have this. I mean, the whole city is mud flooded. Completely mud flooded. And what they've done is just build these boardwalks along, the sidewalk so people can just get around in this mud. And in some cases, they've actually built boardwalks here. It appears as if it's a wooden road, like a boardwalk sidewalk and a boardwalk. And so, this town really looks like it's abandoned in this 1877 photo. And, I know they want to tell us that these photos were taken early in the morning. And here we do see a few horses. But What we can tell with this photo is the time of day that it is. And now here, if you look at this pole and this shadow, we can see that this is not a long shadow. This is not a morning or sunset kind of photo. This is about 10 or 11 o'clock. You know, depending. If this was winter, this could be high noon based on this shadow. So yeah, this is your city at high noon. Again, no long shadows. Look at all the poles. And this one is pretty clear what time of day this is. And, you know, for a city built out like this, you know, I mean, it should be a mess. There should be a mess of people. And so already the narrative doesn't add up. The fact that, you know, it should be built out like this in 10 years. But then, there's no people. There's no people. Here we have a horse. You know, really unusual. You know, and you know, at the very least, we would expect to see, you know, wispy, ghost-like silhouettes all over the place from an open exposure photograph. But we don't see that. You know, and certainly not everybody would be moving. There would be a lot of standing around. You know, a lot of horses. Especially that we can prove without a shadow of a doubt that this is not an early morning picture. Not at all. If this was early morning, this shadow would continue and perhaps even cast into the side of the building some. But we don't see that. Not at all. So let's continue. The cliff house. You know, this cliff house can be seen in many photos. 1894 San Francisco Midwinter International Exposition. So already I believe that this is the same, one of the same photos that we were seeing for the World's Fair in 1915, but apparently it was actually built earlier than that. So again, we have a discrepancy in the narrative. And you know what happened here? Rare pics of the palace. You know, this baby looks like it was hit by a bomb. 1880s. So this is really interesting. 1928 and versus modern times. You know, so this, look at these steps. I mean, what was this? Was this a pyramid? You know, this looks very South American to me almost. And certainly very glorious and very, very palace-like. And now it's just a ruin, almost unrecognizable. And how interesting, you know, how such things might be found all over the place. And here's a case where it was actually better preserved, but it has absolutely been mud flooded. And who knows what was up here at one point. Clearly there was probably some structure. Really amazing, all these ruins. So here's a boat that they discovered. San Francisco was built on abandoned and buried ships of the gold rush. So now that, you know, they're actually telling us that, you know, the gold rush had massive ships and that somehow they got buried. So, you know, here's another proof of, you know, some kind of massive flood here that has actually buried ships. And now they're excavating it. And finally, I just wanted to comment on this photo that I showed in my last video. And so here in 1915, they're showing us the size of the trees. You know, as massive as these columns are, you know, these trees are potentially 75-year-old trees. Again, adding to the age. And 75 years before this photo, again, would make it, you know, 1960-ish. And here you can see now they've grown to the top, all the way to the top of this column. And even the blockwork and the statues on top of the column. If this is modern day, it took the tree another 100 years to grow from this to this. And that's still, you know, I would say that that's still the same tree. That one right there. So, if it took it 100 years to grow from here to a little bit higher than it, 1915, let's just say, to 2015. 100 years to grow from here to here, which tells me that when we're looking at this picture, this is a 100-year-old tree, because it took it another 100 years to grow. And what an amazing tree, actually. That tells us that this is a 200-year-old tree, if we're to believe anything. And again, I was baffled by not only, these old images of the fair in 1915, but also in Chicago in the World's Fair of 1893, that we have palm trees and cacti in Chicago, and old cacti. And again, growing up in Arizona, I know the saguaro cactus, and I know the amount of time it takes for a saguaro cactus to grow. And the idea that they would bring in a bunch of saguaro cactus, full-grown saguaro cacti with arms, and each arm, just an arm takes 100 years to grow. And we have these cacti all over in Chicago, which would not support this type of cactus. And equally here, in San Francisco. While looking at these artificial coastlines, it got me thinking about, everything that we see. Is this little corner artificial? And is this the remnants of something perhaps that was destroyed, as it looks like all around here? It sure looks like it. And now, there's a parking lot. Was there a grand castle here? Because I'm seeing a lot of stuff under here. Let's take off the roads and we'll see it for what it is. So now there are no roads on right now. And yet you can see that these are just poking right through. And there's a lot more. This whole mountainside here is covered with what look to be artificial remnants, a lot of right angles and unnatural looking things under here that have just become overgrown. But to me, these are clearly traces of older civilizations. This is really interesting, the perspective. Just notice these tiny little people right here. And it's not that they're tiny people and these are giants. It's perspective. That's how massive this is. From these people back here to these people is a huge distance, enough to make them look half the size and a quarter size of these people. Just to give you a perspective of how massive this is. And forgive me. I should be clicking on these. It wasn't much better resolution anyway. It brought me to this grand theory, really, that, before, you had the angels and the giants that we talk about in the Bible, and, perhaps everything was giant, and you had this splitting, and this good and this bad of these giants. And later, half of them are wiped out, and yet they had a lot of building, and this a lot of the mountains that we see are just the leftover wars or whatever. In any case, they wipe out the bad ones, and you still have a lot of giant creatures that were left over. First they're going to round up the equal creatures. Those are going to be easier, like the horses and cattle would be for us to round up, and as it gets smaller, it gets harder. You have giant lizards, and these could be our dinosaurs that spilled over. They were harder to catch, just like for us. Again, we could capture the large animals, but your mice and your lizards and your snakes and your smaller things and your underwater creatures, and these are going to be harder to capture. And yes, I mean, so now we have the, bringing order back. We have a bringing of the order back. We still have these Titan-like giants, and these could perhaps be, the good, the good angels. If you have this toroidal field at the base of your building, now you can actually pour material. You could pour, say, your concrete over the top. You'd probably want a looser and fluffier material, but, regardless. And you crank up your machine and you create the frequency, which now will flower, in the shape of the frequency that you're emitting. And now it could probably push up, you could shape your structure from the bottom, and you could push up these concretes and they could solidify, and really, really interesting. But if we look over here, we do see traces of civilization. All of this is very, very anomalous, and you have to look carefully, but it's just buried. But this is not natural formations. And what are we seeing here? I don't know. Let's see if I can get out of here. No, I can't. Oops. Sometimes we shouldn't do things like that. Okay. No, it's not going to let me do that. But yeah, just absolutely amazing. The Relief Society in San Francisco, 1920. You know what? We're missing the... I don't know what that number is. Let's continue. I don't know. This to me almost seems as if it could have been some kind of a corpse. Some mud fossil. Something that died and bled out and was mined for its iron and its blood. Really interesting. And here we go again. And this one actually still exists, and I'm very excited and cannot wait to take a trip to San Francisco just to see these. These actually exist, and I'm so thankful. And, perhaps, all the trees were, for instance, meant to be cut down, but then some were left. Some were left, and what we see in Devil's Tower is an example. Somebody didn't cut the stump down far enough to where it would eventually get covered with mud and dirt and be almost unrecognizable. And with the case of Antiquitech, a lot was left. A lot was left, and, good people may have stepped in and preserved things, and, So I'll see you in the next video, and have a blessed day. Please like, comment, and subscribe.